Imagine this: a single act of kindness, something as small as handing a hungry kid a sandwich, could unravel a web of corruption so deep, so twisted, that it stretches from the streets to the highest halls of power. What if that one moment of compassion didn't just change your day, but set you on a collision course with a criminal empire? What if doing the right thing made you the target of liars, killers, and men who'd sell their souls for a paycheck? That's exactly what happened to Sarah Kane. She wasn't just anyone, a senior Navy SEAL, trained to face death without blinking. Her life was built on discipline, courage, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. She'd stormed enemy strongholds, defused bombs under fire, and walked through chaos most of us couldn't even dream of surviving. But nothing, not a single mission, could have prepared her for the enemy she'd face on a rainy afternoon at a rundown little shop called Corner Mart. It started innocently enough. A boy, barely 10 years old, stood trembling near the counter, his pockets empty, his stomach growling. Tommy, they'd later call him. His eyes darted nervously as the clerk barked at him to leave, accusing him of trying to steal a candy bar he couldn't pay for. The kid's hand shook, clutching a crumpled dollar bill that wasn't enough to cover the cost. Sarah watched from the aisle, her sharp instincts kicking in. Something about the scene tugged at her. Maybe it was the way Tommy's shoulders slumped, or the quiet desperation in his voice as he mumbled an apology. She didn't hesitate. Stepping forward, she pulled a few bills from her wallet, tossed them on the counter, and told the clerk to ring up a sandwich and a drink for the kid. No big deal, right? Just a quick gesture from a woman who couldn't stand to see someone suffer. But that's when the shadows started creeping in. Outside, the rain pounded harder, drumming against the cracked windows of Corner Mart. Sarah barely noticed the patrol car pulling up until the door swung open, and in walked Jake Mercer, a cop with a swagger that didn't match his cheap uniform. His badge glinted under the flickering fluorescent lights. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Sarah like she was prey he'd been hunting all day. Trouble had a way of finding her, even when she wasn't looking for it. Jake's voice cut through the hum of the storm, loud and accusatory. Claimed he'd gotten a call about a theft, pointed a finger straight at Sarah, saying he'd seen her slip something into her jacket, something she hadn't paid for. The clerk nodded along, too quick to agree, like he'd been waiting for the cue. Tommy tried to speak up, his small voice cracking as he shouted that she'd helped him, that she hadn't done anything wrong. But Jake didn't care, didn't even glance at the kid. The air thickened with tension. Sarah stood there, calm as ever, her hands steady at her sides. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, just watched Jake with those piercing eyes, the kind that could see through a lie before it even left your mouth. She knew something was off, knew it the second he walked in. And she was right. This wasn't about a petty theft. This was the first thread in a tapestry of deceit, one that would pull her into a fight she never saw coming. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists, cold metal biting into her skin. Jake smirked as he led her out into the rain, muttering about how she'd regret crossing him. Tommy's cries faded behind her, drowned out by the storm. The patrol car's lights flashed red and blue, casting eerie shadows across the wet pavement. To anyone watching, it looked like justice being served a thief caught in the act. But justice? That was the furthest thing from what was happening here. Sarah Kane wasn't just a woman who'd helped a kid. She was a force, a warrior who'd spent years honing her mind and body for battles bigger than this. And as she sat in the back of that car, rain streaking down the windows, she wasn't scared. She wasn't even angry. Not yet. She was thinking, calculating, piecing together the puzzle that had just landed in her lap. Because Sarah had a secret weapon, one Jake Mercer didn't see coming. Tucked under her jacket, hidden from sight, was a body cam, a tiny device she'd worn out of habit, a holdover from missions where every second could mean life or death. It had been rolling the whole time, capturing every word, every move, every lie. That little camera was about to turn this game upside down. What Jake didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Sarah Kane wasn't the kind of person to go down quietly. She'd been trained to survive, to fight, to win. And this was just the beginning. A single spark that would ignite a firestorm, exposing a network of corruption so vast it reached from the streets of this sleepy town all the way to the marble corridors of power. The shadow serpents were watching. They didn't know it yet, but they just made the worst mistake of their lives. This is Marcus Stories, and tonight we're diving deep into Sarah Kane's war against the shadows. A war that started with a sandwich, a lie, and a woman who refused to break. Buckle up, because this tale is about to take you places you never expected, places where heroes are forged, villains fall, and the truth cuts deeper than any blade. Stay with me. You won't believe what happens next. The rain hadn't let up. It hammered down on the roof of Corner Mart, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to echo the tension brewing inside. Sarah Kane stood near the back of the store, her boots scuffing the worn linoleum floor. She'd only stopped in for a bottle of water, something to keep her going after a long day of training drills. But then she saw him, Tommy, a scrawny kid with patched-up jeans and a mop of damp hair clinging to his forehead. He hovered near the counter, clutching a crumpled dollar bill like it was his last lifeline. The clerk wasn't having it. A burly guy with a stained apron and a scowl that could curdle milk, he loomed over Tommy, barking about how the kid's money wasn't enough for the candy bar in his hand, accused him of trying to sneak it out. Tommy's voice trembled, barely audible over the storm outside. Said he wasn't stealing, that he'd found the dollar in the gutter and just wanted something to eat. His eyes were wide, pleading, the kind of look that could melt even the hardest heart. Sarah's wasn't hard. Not when it came to someone like this, a kid who'd clearly been dealt a rotten hand. She stepped forward, her movements smooth and deliberate, like a predator sizing up a situation. Pulled a few bills from her pocket, nothing fancy, just enough to cover a sandwich, a drink, and that candy bar Tommy was clinging to. Tossed them onto the counter with a quiet thud, told the clerk to ring it up, her voice low but firm, leaving no room for argument. The clerk grumbled, but he took the money, shoving the items into a plastic bag and thrusting it at Tommy. For a moment, it felt like the world made sense again. Tommy looked up at Sarah, his face lighting up with a shy, grateful smile, muttered a quick thank you before clutching the bag to his chest like it was treasure. Sarah just nodded, already turning to leave. Didn't need the praise, didn't want it. She'd done what felt right, and that was enough. But the world doesn't always reward what's right. The door banged open, letting in a gust of wet wind and the sharp glare of headlights from a patrol car parked outside. Jake Mercer swaggered in, rain dripping off his cap, his badge catching the dim light like a warning sign. He wasn't tall, wasn't imposing, but there was something oily about him, a slick confidence that didn't match the frayed edges of his uniform. His eyes swept the room, predatory, locking onto Sarah like he'd been waiting for her all along. Trouble didn't just walk in, it strutted. His voice sliced through the quiet, loud and brassy, dripping with accusation. Said he'd gotten a call about a theft at Corner Mart. Claimed he'd seen it all through the window, Sarah slipping something into her jacket, something she hadn't paid for. Pointed at her with a finger that trembled just slightly, betraying the lie he was spinning. The clerk jumped in, too eager, nodding like a puppet on strings, backed up Jake's story, saying he'd noticed her acting suspicious the whole time. It was a setup, a cheap, clumsy one, but a setup all the same. Tommy's bag hit the floor with a soft thud. He stepped forward, his small frame shaking with a mix of fear and defiance, shouted that it wasn't true, that Sarah had paid for everything, that she'd helped him when no one else would. His voice cracked, high and desperate, cutting through the lies like a knife. But Jake didn't even glance at him, just waved a hand, dismissing the kid like he was nothing more than a buzzing fly. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. Stood there, hands loose at her sides, her face a mask of calm that hid the storm brewing inside. She'd faced worse than this gunfire. Ambushes, Men twice her size with murder in their eyes. A small-town cop with a flimsy story didn't scare her, but it pissed her off. The injustice of it. The way Jake twisted a good deed into a crime. The way he ignored Tommy's pleas. It lit a slow, steady fire in her gut. The air in Corner Mart grew heavy, thick with the weight of what was happening. Jake pulled out his cuffs, the metal glinting as he stepped closer. Kept talking, piling on the accusations. Said she'd been caught red-handed. That she'd be lucky to see daylight again after this. His smirk widened, smug and careless, like he thought he'd already won. He hadn't. Not by a long shot. Sarah's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, taking him in. The way he moved, too fast, too nervous. The way the clerk wouldn't meet her gaze. The way this whole thing stank of something bigger, something uglier than a petty theft bust. She didn't say a word as the cuffs snapped around her wrists, cold and tight, locking her hands behind her back. Didn't resist as Jake shoved her toward the door, his grip rougher than it needed to be. Outside, the rain soaked through her jacket, plastering her hair to her face. Tommy's shouts followed her, fainter now, swallowed by the roar of the storm. Called her name Sarah. Sarah begging someone, anyone, to listen. No one did. The clerk turned away, counting his cash. The few customers in the store kept their heads down, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. Jake pushed her into the patrol car, slamming the door with a force that rattled the frame. Climbed into the driver's seat, muttering under his breath about how she'd messed with the wrong guy. The engine growled to life, tires splashing through puddles as they pulled away from Corner Mart. Red and blue lights spun, painting the night with an eerie glow. To the world, it looked like a clean arrest. A thief hauled off to face the consequences. But Sarah knew better, felt it in her bones, in the steady rhythm of her pulse. This wasn't about justice. This was a trap, crude, sloppy, but deliberate. And Jake Mercer? He wasn't just a crooked cop. He was a pawn in something much darker. She shifted in the back seat, the cuffs digging into her skin. Didn't matter. Pain was an old friend, one she'd learned to ignore years ago. What mattered was the tiny device still humming against her chest, hidden under her jacket. The body cam, recording every second of this farce, the lies, the setup, the smug tilt of Jake's head as he drove her toward whatever fate he'd planned. Sarah Kane wasn't scared. She wasn't helpless. She was pissed, and she was ready. This wasn't the end. It was the spark. The first move in a game Jake didn't even know he'd started. A game that would drag him, and everyone behind him, into the light whether they liked it or not. The Shadow Serpents had no idea what they'd just unleashed. The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale coffee, a heavy stillness hanging over the rows of benches. Rain tapped against the tall windows, a restless rhythm that matched the growing unease inside. Sarah Kane sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded calmly in front of her, the cuffs long gone but their weight still a memory on her wrists. She wore a plain gray jacket, her hair pulled back tight, every inch of her screaming discipline. The room buzzed with whispers, curious onlookers, a handful of reporters, all waiting to see how this small-time theft case would play out. They had no idea what was coming. Across the room, Miles Vaughn paced like a lion circling its prey. The prosecutor's suit was crisp, his voice smooth and sharp, cutting through the air with practiced ease. Laid out the charges with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Said Sarah had been caught stealing from Corner Mart, that the evidence was airtight, that she'd be lucky to avoid a stiff sentence. Painted her as a petty crook, a nobody who'd slipped up and gotten nabbed. He couldn't have been more wrong. Jake Mercer took the stand next, his uniform pressed but his posture slouched, a nervous twitch in his fingers giving him away. Swore under oath that he'd seen it all. Sarah stuffing something into her jacket, sneaking past the clerk, thinking she'd get away clean. His words dripped with fake certainty, each syllable rehearsed but shaky at the edges. Kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding Sarah's steady gaze, like he could feel the heat of it burning through his lies. The crowd ate it up. Murmurs rippled through the benches, disapproval, judgment, the usual noise of people quick to believe the worst. Miles flashed a smug grin. leaning back in his chair, already tasting victory. Judge Eleanor Hart sat high above them all, her face a mask of stern patience, gavel resting lightly in her hand. Called for order when the whispers grew too loud, her voice firm but fair, demanding silence. Sarah didn't move, didn't fidget, just watched, her mind turning like a machine, every gear clicking into place. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt it in the patrol car, in the way Jake's story didn't add up. This wasn't her first battlefield, and she wasn't about to lose on someone else's turf. Miles finished his questions, stepping back with a flourish, inviting Sarah's side to respond. Her lawyer, a wiry guy with glasses too big for his face, started to stand, fumbling with papers, ready to bumble through a weak defense. But Sarah raised a hand, stopping him cold, stood up herself, slow and deliberate, her presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. The whispers died, every eye locked on her, waiting. She didn't waste time, started speaking, her voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. Said she wasn't just some drifter caught in a petty crime. Revealed who she really was, a senior Navy SEAL, years of service under her belt. Missions that would make most men in this room break out in a cold sweat. The air shifted, heavy with shock, disbelief hanging thick as fog. Miles laughed a short, nervous bark, trying to brush it off. Called it a bluff, a desperate lie from a cornered thief. But Sarah wasn't done. Reached into her jacket, slow and careful, pulling out a small device that gleamed faintly under the courtroom lights. Her body cam told them it had been recording the whole time, every second at Corner Mart, every word Jake had spat out, every move he'd made. The room erupted, gasps, shouts, a chaos of voices crashing against the walls. Judge Eleanor Hart slammed her gavel down, sharp and commanding, ordering the footage to be played. A clerk scrambled to set up a screen, hands shaking as he plugged in the device. The crowd leaned forward, breathless, the anticipation so thick you could choke on it. The video flickered to life, grainy but clear enough to damn. Showed Sarah at the counter, paying for Tommy's food, her hands steady and open, no theft, no sneaking, just a quiet act of kindness. Then Jake bursting in, his accusations loud and hollow, his story falling apart frame by frame. The clerk's nods looked forced now, his eyes darting like a rat caught in a trap. And there, in the background, a shadow near the door. Another figure in a uniform, too blurry to name, but enough to raise questions. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Miles froze, his smugness draining away, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Jake went pale, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands gripping the edge of the stand like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The truth hung there, undeniable, a spotlight on his lies. Sarah didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just stood there, her gaze locked on Jake, letting the weight of it crush him. Judge Eleanor Hart leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, voice like steel as she demanded an explanation. But Jake didn't have one, not one that would hold water. His breathing hitched, panic clawing up his throat, and then he bolted. Chairs scraped as he lunged from the stand, shoving past the bailiff, sprinting for the door. The room exploded again, shouts, gasps, the gavel banging uselessly against the roar. Miles yelled something, incoherent and frantic, but Sarah was already moving. Instinct kicked in, her body a blur of motion, years of training snapping into gear. She vaulted over the table, boots hitting the floor with a thud that echoed, dodged a reporter who stumbled into her path, her eyes locked on Jake's retreating back. He crashed through the double doors, disappearing into the hall, but Sarah was right behind him, a hunter, closing in on prey. The crowd spilled out after her, a wave of chaos, but she didn't care, didn't hear them. All she saw was Jake. All she felt was the pulse of the chase. Rain greeted them outside, slicking the steps of the courthouse, turning the stone treacherous. Jake slipped, cursed, scrambling to his feet as Sarah closed the gap. He darted toward the parking lot, fumbling for his keys, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Didn't make it far. Sarah tackled him hard, driving him into the wet pavement, pinning his arms with a grip like iron. He thrashed, wild and desperate, spitting curses that dissolved into pleas. Said he didn't mean it, that he had no choice, that they'd made him do it. Sarah tightened her hold, her voice low and cold, demanding names. Who? Who'd set this up? Jake's eyes widened, fear swallowing him whole. And then it spilled out the Shadow Serpents. A name that meant nothing to the crowd now, but everything to Sarah. The courthouse steps buzzed with onlookers, phones out, recording the mess. Sarah hauled Jake up, his uniform soaked and muddy, his fight gone. Handed him off to the stunned bailiff, who'd finally caught up, her expression unreadable. The rain kept falling, washing away the last of Jake's bravado, leaving only the truth raw, ugly, and far from finished. This wasn't over. The video had cracked the surface, but beneath it lay a darkness Sarah was only starting to glimpse. The Shadow Serpents weren't just a name. They were a promise of danger, of power, of a fight she'd have to face alone. Or so she thought. Night swallowed the town, the rain finally easing into a damp, clinging mist. Sarah Kane moved through it like a ghost, her boots silent against the cracked asphalt. Dockside 13 loomed ahead, a rotting stretch of waterfront, where rusted cranes jutted into the sky like skeletal fingers. The air stank of salt and diesel, thick with the promise of secrets better left buried. Jake's confession echoed in her mind. Shadow Serpents. A name that carried weight, a whisper of something far bigger than a crooked cop's lie. She'd pressed him hard on those courthouse steps, his voice breaking as he spat out the location. A meet at the docks, tonight, under the cover of darkness. No backup, no plan beyond getting in and getting answers. Just her, the body cam still strapped to her chest, and a fire in her gut that wouldn't let her walk away. The warehouses lined the pier, their windows black and shattered, shadows pooling in the gaps. She slipped past a chain-link fence, the metal cold against her fingers as she eased it aside. Voices drifted on the wind, low, clipped, edged with tension. Sarah crouched behind a stack of crates, her breathing steady, eyes scanning the scene unfolding ahead. Men moved in the dim glow of a single floodlight, their silhouettes sharp against the night. Crates were being unloaded from a battered truck, wooden boxes stamped with faded markings, pried open to reveal glints of steel. Guns, rifles, handguns, even what looked like military-grade hardware, all stacked and ready for hands that shouldn't have them. The Shadow Serpents weren't just a gang, they were an arsenal. Then she saw him. Victor Slade, captain of the local police, his broad frame unmistakable even in the half-light. He stood apart, barking orders, his voice a gravelly growl that carried over the lapping waves. Uniform traded for a dark jacket, but the authority clung to him corrupt, twisted. A man who wore power like a second skin. He inspected a crate, nodding to a wiry guy with a clipboard, his movements casual, like this was just another night on the job. Sarah's pulse quickened, but her hands stayed steady. This was it, the thread connecting Jake's setup to something uglier. She slid her phone from her pocket, silent as a shadow, angling it to snap photos. The screen flashed faintly with each shot Slade's face. The weapons, the truck's license plate. Evidence, hard and cold, proof that the rot went deeper than she'd imagined. A sound snapped her focus, a crate shifting, wood scraping against wood. One of the men turned, his head cocked, eyes narrowing as he scanned the dark. Rico Snake, they called him, a lean figure, with a scar curling down his cheek like a warning. He stepped away from the group, his boots crunching on gravel, a pistol dangling loosely in his hand. Sarah pressed herself lower, her body melding with the crates, breath held tight in her chest. He stopped, inches from her hiding spot, head tilting like a hound catching a scent. The floodlight caught his face hard, alert, the kind of man who thrived on suspicion. Muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, then kicked at the ground, sending a pebble skittering into the shadows. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. Years of training kept her still, a statue carved from steel and silence. Then it happened. Her phone buzzed once, sharp, a text notification she hadn't silenced. The sound cut through the quiet like a gunshot. Rico's head whipped around, his pistol snapping up, eyes locking on her position. Shouted a warning, harsh and guttural, and the night erupted. Sarah bolted, sprang from the crates like a coiled spring, her legs pumping as she darted toward the maze of warehouses. Shouts exploded behind her, boots pounding the ground, the sharp crack of a gunshot splitting the air. A bullet ricocheted off a metal beam, sparks flaring in her peripheral vision. She ducked low, weaving between stacks of cargo, her heart slamming against her ribs, but her mind razor sharp. Rico was fast, too fast, leading the pack, his voice barking orders over the chaos. More shots rang out, wild and desperate, tearing through the mist. Sarah hit a narrow alley between two buildings, the walls closing in, slick with damp rot. Skidded around a corner, her boots sliding on wet concrete, catching herself against a rusted dumpster. Kept moving, every step a calculation, every breath fuel for the next. The docks were a labyrinth, twisting paths, dead ends. A sprawl of decay she turned to her advantage, dove behind a pile of fishing nets, the stench of salt and rot choking her lungs. Peered through the tangle, watching as Rico and his crew fanned out, their flashlights slicing through the dark. They were close, too close, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the ground. She needed a way out, spotted a gap in the fence, half hidden by a stack of barrels, leading to the open water's edge. Took a breath, deep and steady, then made her move. Sprinted hard, ignoring the burn in her legs, the shouts growing louder as they spotted her. A bullet whizzed past, grazing the air near her shoulder, but she didn't flinch, couldn't afford to. Reached the fence, slid through the gap like a thread through a needle, tearing her jacket on the jagged wire. Hit the ground running, the pier stretching out ahead, waves crashing below. Rico roared in frustration, his crew piling up at the bottleneck, too bulky to follow fast. Sarah didn't look back, kept going, her boots pounding the warped boards, the mist swallowing her whole. She'd made it for now. Slipped into the night, the photos burning a hole in her pocket, Victor Slade's face etched into her memory. The Shadow Serpents weren't just a name anymore. They were real, armed, and tied to the top of the police force. This wasn't a hunch. It was a war, one she'd just stepped into, alone and outgunned. Her lungs burned, her body ached, but her mind was clear. The body cam had caught it all, the deal, the guns, Slade's presence, evidence that could crack this wide open if she could get it to the right hands. But the chase wasn't over. Rico's shouts faded, but his rage lingered. A promise that they'd come for her again. Sarah Kane wasn't running away. She was running toward something, toward answers, toward justice, toward the heart of the snake pit. And she'd be damned if she let them slither away. Dockside 13 fell silent behind her, but the night was far from done. The city hummed under a shroud of fog, streetlights flickering like dying stars. Sarah Kane slipped through the back alleys, her jacket still torn from Dockside 13. Her breath, a faint cloud in the chill. She couldn't do this alone anymore. The photos burned in her pocket, Victor Slade's face, the guns, the Shadow Serpent's dirty hands all over it. Evidence that could bury them, but only if she survived long enough to use it. Her mind raced, sifting through options, landing on a name she hadn't thought of in years. Logan Pierce, ex-FBI. A man who'd walked away from the badge when the system turned sour. If anyone could help her navigate this mess, it was him. Finding him wasn't easy. Took her to a dive bar on the edge of town, a hole in the wall called the Rusty Anchor, where the air reeked of stale beer and broken dreams. She pushed through the creaky door, eyes scanning the dim room pool tables, a jukebox spitting out a scratchy tune. A handful of drunks slumped over their glasses. Logan sat in the corner, nursing a whiskey, his broad shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of a past. He couldn't shake. He looked up as she approached, Gray eyes sharp beneath a mess of dark hair. Knew her instantly, even after all this time. Didn't smile. Didn't flinch, just nodded. Like he'd been expecting her to crash back into his life. She slid into the booth across from him, wasting no words. Laid it out fast, the setup at Corner Mart, the trial, Dockside 13, Slade's involvement. Showed him the photos, her fingers steady despite the storm inside. Logan listened, his face a mask of stone, sipping his drink like she was reciting the weather. But his eyes betrayed him, narrowed, flickered with something dark, when she mentioned the shadow serpents. Finished his whiskey in one slow gulp, then leaned forward, voice low and rough. Said he'd heard whispers about them, rumors of a network, too deep to touch, too dangerous to chase. Told her she was in over her head, but the glint in his gaze said he was already in, whether he liked it or not. They needed more, a name, a lead, something to tie Slade to the bigger picture. Logan had a hunch Damien Holt, a mid-level player in the Serpents game, known for running their dirty deals. Word was, he'd be at a derelict garage across town tonight, overseeing a cash drop. Sarah didn't hesitate, grabbed her gear phone, body cam, a knife tucked into her boot, and followed Logan into the night. The garage squatted in an industrial wasteland, its walls peeling, windows smashed out like empty sockets. Rusted cars littered the lot, skeletons of a forgotten time. They crept closer, sticking to the shadows, the hum of a generator buzzing in the distance. Inside, Damien Holt stood under a flickering bulb, a tall figure in a leather coat, counting stacks of cash with a smirk that said he owned the world. Two goons flanked him, armed and restless, their eyes darting to every creak of the wind. Sarah and Logan split up, her circling left, him right, moving like wolves closing in. She crouched behind a busted engine block, peering through the grime-streaked window. Watched Damien stuff the cash into a duffel, his movements slick, confident. Logan signaled her from across the lot. A quick flash of his hand, time to move. She eased forward, silent as death, ready to corner him and squeeze out the truth. It went wrong fast. A board snapped under Logan's boot, the sound sharp and betraying. Damien's head jerked up, his smirk vanishing, hand diving for the gun at his hip. Shouted a warning, his voice booming through the garage, and the goons spun, weapons raised. Sarah didn't wait, burst through the side door, her body low, charging straight at Damien before he could fire. She tackled him hard, slamming him into a workbench, tools clattering to the floor. He fought back, wiry and fierce, landing a punch that grazed her jaw. She barely felt it, twisted his arm, pinned him down, her knee digging into his chest. Logan grappled with the goons, fists flying, a gunshot ringing out as he disarmed one, sending the pistol skittering across the concrete. Damien snarled, thrashing under her grip, but she tightened her hold, voice cutting through his curses. Demanded to know who pulled Slade's strings, who ran the shadow serpents. His eyes widened, fear flashing beneath the bravado, and then he broke. Gasped out that Slade was just a puppet, a frontman for someone higher, someone untouchable. Started to say more, a name forming on his lips, when the window shattered. Glass rained down, a sniper's bullet tearing through the night. It hit Damien square in the chest, blood blooming dark and fast, his body slumping beneath her. Sarah rolled off, diving for cover as more shots screamed through the garage. Logan yelled, dragging her behind a car, the metal pinging with each impact. The goons scattered, one dropping with a cry, the other bolting into the dark. Chaos erupted. Tires screeched outside a black van peeling into the lot, shadow serpents spilling out, their silhouettes bristling with guns. Sarah's heart pounded, adrenaline flooding her veins, but her mind stayed ice cold. Grabbed her phone, snapped a blurry shot of the attackers through the wreckage, the body cam still rolling. Logan fired back, his stolen pistol barking, buying them seconds. They couldn't stay. The van's crew advanced, relentless, bullets chewing up the garage walls, cars, everything in their path. Sarah spotted a back exit, half blocked by debris, and pointed. Logan nodded, covering her as she sprinted, shoving aside a rusted barrel. Bullets chased them, splintering wood, sparking off steel, the air thick with dust and gunpowder. She dove through the gap, Logan right behind, hitting the ground hard outside, kept running, weaving through the maze of abandoned machinery. The serpents' shouts fading, but their intent clear: they'd kill to keep this quiet. Sarah's lungs burned, her jaw throbbing from Damien's hit, but she clutched the phone tight, the new evidence searing into her resolve. Damien's words hung heavy. Slade was a puppet. Someone else pulled the strings. Someone who just silenced their own man to protect the secret. The attack wasn't random. It was a warning, a declaration of war from the shadows. Sarah and Logan vanished into the night, battered but alive, the stakes higher than ever. The shadow serpents weren't just hunting her now. They were scared, and that made them dangerous. But Sarah Kane wasn't backing down. Not after this. The city sprawled beneath a moonless sky, its edges jagged and restless. Sarah Kane and Logan Pierce huddled in a cramped motel room, the air thick with dust and the faint hum of a neon sign buzzing outside. They'd barely escaped the garage, their clothes still streaked with grime, the echo of gunfire ringing in their ears. Sarah's phone sat on the chip table between them, its screen glowing with the blurry shot she'd snapped shadow. Serpents storming in, faceless but ruthless. Damien Holt's blood-soaked confession played on repeat in her mind. Slade was a puppet. Someone bigger loomed above him, pulling strings from the dark. Logan cracked open a laptop, his fingers flying across the keys, digging through old FBI contacts and back channels he hadn't touched in years. The photos from Dockside 13 Slade with the guns were their starting point. Cross-referenced them with whispers he'd heard, rumors of a power player bankrolling the Serpent's rise. Hours bled into the night, coffee gone cold, until a name surfaced, sharp and cold as a blade. Senator Marcus Drayton. It hit like a punch. Drayton, a polished politician with a smile that charmed voters, and a reputation spotless as fresh snow. But beneath the suits and speeches, Logan found cracks: offshore accounts, coded messages, a trail of cash leading straight to the Serpent's coffers. Sarah stared at the screen, her jaw tight, the pieces snapping into place. Slade wasn't the head of this snake. Drayton was, and he'd been watching her all along. The motel phone rang, shrill and sudden, shattering the silence. Sarah snatched it up, her gut twisting before the voice even came through. It was low, smooth, dripping with menace. Drayton himself. No proxy this time. Said he knew what she had, what she'd seen. Told her she'd gone too far, dug too deep. And now there was a price. A rustle in the background, then a cry, soft, terrified, unmistakable. Clara Kane, Sarah's mother. Her heart stopped, ice flooding her veins. The line crackled as Drayton laid out his terms. Hand over the photos, the body cam footage, every shred of evidence, or Clara wouldn't see sunrise. Gave her an address, Raven's Hollow Warehouse, a derelict shell on the outskirts, and a deadline, midnight. Then the call cut dead, leaving only the echo of Clara's voice, fragile and pleading. Sarah's hands shook not from fear, but rage. Logan reached for her, his face grim, saying they needed a plan, needed help. She shook him off, eyes burning with a fire he hadn't seen before. This wasn't just a mission now, it was personal. Clara, gentle, fierce Clara, who'd raised her alone, who'd taught her to fight even when the world broke her, was in the hands of a monster. And Sarah would tear the earth apart to get her back. They pieced it together fast. Raven's Hollow was a trap, Drayton's endgame. A place to bury her, and the truth in one clean sweep. Logan mapped it out: an old shipping depot, rusted and sprawling, surrounded by empty fields and choked with shadows. Perfect for an ambush. Sarah didn't care. Loaded her gear knife, phone, a pistol Logan pressed into her hand, her movements sharp, mechanical, every ounce of her SEAL training locking into place. Logan insisted on coming, his voice steady but edged with worry. Said she couldn't face this alone. Not against Drayton's crew. She nodded. But her mind was already at the warehouse, already with Clara. They slipped out into the night, the motel fading behind them, the city's hum giving way to the eerie quiet of the outskirts. Headlights off, they rolled up a dirt track, parking a quarter-mile out, creeping closer on foot. Raven's Hollow loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the black sky. Its walls sagged, metal groaning in the wind, windows gaping like hollow eyes. Faint light flickered inside movement, voices, the glint of guns. Sarah crouched low, Logan at her side, peering through the overgrowth. Counted at least 6 men serpents, armed to the teeth, patrolling the perimeter. Drayton was there too, his tall frame pacing near a stack of crates, his voice barking orders. Then she saw her, Clara, bound to a chair in the center of the warehouse, her gray hair tangled, face bruised but defiant. A guard stood over her, rifle slung across his chest, his sneer visible even from this distance. Sarah's breath caught, a raw ache clawing at her chest. Clara didn't cry, didn't beg, just sat there, chin up, staring down her captors like she dared them to try harder. Logan whispered a warning. Too many, too risky, suggested calling in favors, getting back up. Sarah shook her head, her voice a hiss in the dark. No time. Midnight was ticking closer, and Drayton wasn't bluffing. Every second Clara sat there was a second too long. She'd trained for this: raids, rescues, impossible odds. This was her fight, her blood, her soul on the line. They split the plan fast. Logan would flank left, draw fire, create chaos. Sarah would go straight in, cut through the heart of it, get to Clara. No room for error, no second chances. She checked her watch. 11:45. 15 minutes to midnight. 15 minutes to save the only family she had left. Logan squeezed her shoulder, a silent promise, then melted into the shadows. Sarah took a breath, deep and steady, the night wrapping around her like armor. Felt the weight of the pistol, the cold steel of the knife, the fire in her veins. This wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about the woman who taught her to stand, to fight, to never bow. Drayton thought he'd broken her, thought he'd won. He was wrong. She rose from the grass, a shadow among shadows, moving toward Raven's Hollow like a storm about to break. The serpents didn't see her coming, not yet. But they would. And when they did, they'd learn what happens when you threaten Sarah Kane's world. Midnight was closing in, and so was she. The wind howled through Raven's Hollow warehouse, rattling the rusted walls like a death rattle. Midnight hung heavy, the air electric with the promise of blood. Sarah Kane crept along the edge of the building, her silhouette a flicker in the dark. Logan Pierce moved parallel, a shadow on the left flank, his pistol gripped tight. The plan was simple: chaos and precision. A 1-2 punch to rip through the shadow serpent's trap. 6 guards patrolled the perimeter, their flashlights slicing through the gloom, rifles slung low but ready. Inside, Senator Marcus Drayton waited, a spider in his web. Clara Kane at the center. She peered through a broken window, glass crunching under her boots. Saw her mother Clara still tied to that chair, her face swollen from a fresh bruise, gray hair falling loose. But her eyes burned, fierce and unbowed, staring down the guard pacing in front of her. Sarah's chest tightened, love and fury twisting into a knot. Drayton stood nearby, his tailored coat a stark contrast to the filth around him, his voice smooth as he barked orders into a phone. No more waiting. Logan fired first, a single shot cracking the night, dropping a guard near the entrance. Shouts erupted, the serpents spinning toward the sound, weapons snapping up. Sarah seized the moment, slipping through a side door, her knife flashing as she took down another guard, silent, swift, his body crumpling before he could scream. Chaos bloomed, gunfire popping like fireworks, Logan drawing their attention while she cut deeper inside. The warehouse was a maze of crates and shadows, the air thick with rust and gunpowder. She dodged a burst of bullets, the rounds chewing up a stack of boxes, splinters flying, kept moving, low and fast, her SEAL instincts driving every step. Heard Drayton's voice rise, sharp and commanding, ordering his men to lock it down, to find her. He didn't panic, didn't need to, thought he held all the cards. He was about to lose the deck. Logan's gunfire echoed from the west, a steady rhythm pinning down two more guards. Sarah reached the center, sliding behind a crate, her eyes locking on Clara. The guard watching her mother turned, distracted by the noise, his rifle swinging wide. Big mistake. She lunged, slamming into him, her elbow cracking his jaw, her knife sinking into his side. He dropped with a gurgle, blood pooling dark on the concrete. Clara's head jerked up, recognition flashing through her fear. Sarah ripped the ropes free, hands steady despite the chaos, pulling her mother to her feet, whispered that she was here, that it was over. But Clara's grip tightened. Her voice a rasp said, "It wasn't done. Not yet." Pointed toward Drayton, who'd turned now, his phone dropping as he saw them, his face twisting into a snarl. He drew a pistol, sleek and silver, leveling it with a calm that chilled the blood. Started talking smooth, venomous, saying Sarah should have stayed quiet, should have handed over the evidence and walked away. Said he'd built an empire she couldn't touch, that her little crusade ended here. Took a step closer, the gun steady, his eyes glinting with the certainty of a man who'd never lost. Sarah stepped in front of Clara, shielding her, her own pistol raised. Told him he'd underestimated her, underestimated them both. The warehouse shook with the battle outside, Logan holding the line. The serpent's numbers thinning, but here, time slowed, the standoff stretching taut as a wire. Drayton laughed, low and cold, saying she'd die for nothing, that Clara would watch her bleed out before he finished them both. Then Clara moved. Not weak, not broken, faster than anyone expected. Grabbed the fallen guard's rifle from the floor, her hands trembling but sure, years of quiet strength surging to the surface. Drayton's eyes flicked to her, too late, his smirk faltering as she raised the barrel. A single shot roared, deafening in the hollow space, the bullet tearing through his chest, blood spraying across his pristine coat. He staggered, shock freezing his face, the pistol slipping from his fingers, collapsed to his knees. A king toppled, his empire crumbling in the echo of that shot. Clara dropped the rifle, her breath ragged, staring at the man she'd killed not with fear, but with a mother's fire, a vow to protect her daughter at any cost. Sarah caught her as she swayed, pulling her close, their foreheads touching, a silent promise amid the wreckage. The fight wasn't over. Serpents burst through the far door, drawn by the gunshot, their shouts furious and desperate. Sarah spun, firing back, her bullets dropping one as Logan stormed in from the side, his pistol blazing. Together, they cut through the last of them, precise, brutal. A dance of survival, honed by years of scars. Bodies hit the floor, the warehouse falling silent, the air heavy with smoke and death. They'd won. Barely. Sarah checked Clara, bruised, shaken, but alive. Logan limped over, blood streaking his arm, nodding that he was fine. The evidence phone, body cam still clung to her, battered but intact, a lifeline to the truth. Drayton's corpse lay sprawled, his reign ended, but the shadow serpent's roots ran deep. This was a blow, not a finish. Sirens wailed in the distance. Faint but growing, someone had called it in. Logan's old FBI instincts kicked in, saying they needed to move, needed to get the proof out clean. Sarah agreed, but not to the locals, not with Slade's stench still on the force. Pulled a number from memory, a contact she'd hoped to never need. Agent Nathan Brooks, CLA, a man who'd owe her after this. They slipped out the back, Clara leaning on Sarah, Logan covering their retreat. Reached their car as headlights pierced the fog. Brooks' team, black SUVs rolling in hard and fast. Sarah handed over the phone. The body cam, every frame of Dockside 13, every word from Damien. Every second of this night. Brooks watched the footage, his face grim, promising it'd go straight to the top. That the serpents wouldn't slither away this time. Days later, it broke. News channels blared the story. Senator Marcus Drayton exposed. His empire of guns and corruption laid bare. Arrests rolled out. Slade dragged from his office in cuffs. The Shadow Serpent's network collapsing under the weight of Sarah's evidence. The world saw it justice, hard-won and bloody. A testament to one woman's war. Clara stood beside her, healing but unbroken, her hand tight in Sarah's. Logan watched from the sidelines, a faint smile cracking his stone facade. Raven's Hollow was behind them, a graveyard of their fight, but the victory lingered sharp, real. A light carved from the dark. The Shadow Serpents were done. For now, the dust settled over Raven's Hollow, a quiet graveyard under a gray dawn. The sirens had faded, the chaos reduced to echoes in the wind. Sarah Kane stood on a rooftop overlooking the city, her jacket patched where it had torn, her hands steady despite the bruises painting her skin. Logan Pierce leaned against the ledge beside her, his arm bandaged, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. Below, the streets buzzed with life cars crawling, lights blinking, a world oblivious to the war they just fought. Freedom tasted bitter. The Shadow Serpents were broken Slade in chains. Drayton's empire ashes on the newsreels. Agent Nathan Brooks' team dismantling what was left. The evidence had done its job. A blade through the heart of corruption, exposing every deal, every lie. Reporters called it a victory, a triumph of justice, plastering Sarah's name across headlines she'd never read. But it didn't feel finished. Not to her. Clara was safe now, resting at home, her wounds healing slower than her spirit. That shot she'd fired straight through Drayton's chest still lingered in Sarah's mind. A mother's love turned lethal to save her daughter. They'd hugged tight that night. No words needed, just the weight of survival binding them closer than ever. Logan flicked his cigarette away, the embers spiraling into the dark. Said it was over, that they'd done what no one else could. His voice carried a rare softness, a crack in his armor. But Sarah shook her head, looked out at the city, its shadows stretching long and deep, hiding secrets still unturned. Knew the serpents were just one head of a hydra cut it off, and others would grow. She'd fought too hard, lost too much, to walk away now. The body cam was gone, handed off to Brooks, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. This wasn't the end of her war, it was the beginning. A promise to herself, to Clara, to every kid like Tommy caught in the crossfire. Crime didn't sleep, and neither would she. Logan watched her, his gray eyes tracing the steel in her stance. Didn't argue, knew better than to try, just nodded. A silent pact that he'd be there when she called, when the next fight came. Took a step back, melting into the morning haze, leaving her alone with the skyline and her thoughts. The city breathed below, a restless beast full of light and dark. Sarah's mind churned with questions. How many Draytons still hid behind polished masks? How many Slades wore badges they didn't deserve? Justice had won this round, but at what cost? Blood, pain, a mother's trembling hands on a gun. Was it victory if the scars never faded? That's the thing about truth. It's messy, jagged, never as clean as the stories make it seem. She'd torn the veil off the Shadow Serpents, but the shadows remained, whispering of battles yet to come. Her legacy wasn't peace, it was defiance. A fire that wouldn't die. A line in the sand for anyone who dared cross it. So here's the question for you, listening out there. Does justice ever truly win? Or is it just a moment of flicker before the next fight begins? Think about it. Let it sit with you, heavy and real, because this isn't just Sarah's story. It's ours too. This is Trial Tales, where the fight for what's right never ends. If Sarah Kane's journey hit you hard, smash that like button and subscribe to Trial Tales. We've got more stories coming to keep you on the edge. Stay with us. The shadows aren't done yet.